1 year after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned abortion rights, what impact has that decision had across the United States? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. We'll take a closer look at the decision on abortion rights. Also, the court will make decisions on 10 remaining cases this week. Among those cases will be student debt relief and affirmative action. Meanwhile, it's been more than a year since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, a 50-year-old measure that granted constitutional protection for the right to an abortion. CGTN's Jim Spellman was with protesters over the weekend right here in Washington.
It's been an agonizing year for those who support abortion rights in the United States. Many of the women at this rally say it's felt like the country has stepped back in time. Marjorie McKee traveled from North Carolina.
I feel like I'm living in a surreal United States. I'm in my 50s. I've obviously appreciated Roe v. Wade during the majority of my lifetime, and I never thought I'd be out here doing this again.
I now have less rights than my mother did growing up, almost, because she was born in '68, so.
The overturning of Roe versus Wade sent the issue back to the states. In the last year, about half of the 50 United States have significantly limited access to abortion. Kirsten and Adrian Daly are mother and daughter. They traveled from Pennsylvania for the rally.
It's devastating to lose a right I had my entire life. Last year, we were waiting in Pittsburgh to hear the decision, and we were there for decision day, and I cried.
Well, Mom remembered when we got the right. I was 13, and I've watched women gain their rights, and I knew when Trump was going against Hillary, I tried to tell everybody, he's going to take us back 50 years. Well, he took us back 150 years, and this is about control. This is about control, plain and simple.
Abortion rights have always been a major issue in American politics, but since the overturning of Roe versus Wade a year ago, it has supercharged this as a political issue. These advocates say they will use the issue to drive voter turnout and support pro-choice candidates at the state and local level and in next year's presidential election.
I am voting, I am supporting campaigns, I am trying to do my best to make sure that women have access to these services. It should be legal, and we have to stop this war on women.
All of the people we've spoken here with at this rally tell us they won't give up until abortion is legal in all 50 states. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Rina Shah is a political analyst and current affairs commentator. Joseph Williams is a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. From Miami, we're joined by Jadan, who is a political and cultural commentator and editor-in-chief of Soigné. And Eleanor Clift is a political columnist for the Daily Beast. Welcome to all of you. Rina Shah, 1 year after conservatives got their way and overturned the constitutional right to abortion, it turns out that many Americans do not like the idea of abortion bans or restrictions. In fact, there was a poll done by NPR PBS, and it showed that 57% of those polled said they oppose overturning Roe versus Wade. That's, of course, the legislation that gave women the right in the first place. And there is opposition to this in very unlikely places. I mean, you take the state of Kansas, which is a Republican state. People there defeated a referendum to revoke rights. So how big a problem is this for the GOP?
I think the abortion issue in 2023 into 2024 is going to continue to loom so large over the Republican Party that the party writ large is not going to know what to do about it. Just recently, we heard from Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel say that she wants candidates to start talking about abortion. And I was just recently with her this past weekend, and I asked the question, really, why? Why do you want candidates to have to stand up for their beliefs? She said, well, what we saw in the last cycle, particularly in the midterms, is when Republicans ran in certain parts of the country, their opponents framed them as more extreme than they actually were on the position of abortion. Sure, a lot of Republican candidates are pro-life, meaning they're anti-abortion. And so the language they use is vehemently in favor of banning abortions. Now, rarely do many of them come out very openly and say what exact mark they want that at. And that's what the RNC chair wants them to do. She wants them to start talking about where they believe life is capable of experiencing pain. And so she said a lot of Republicans agree on the 15-week mark, such as Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He's come out in strong favor of talking about abortions being banned after 15 weeks. But what I pushed back on the RNC chair privately and said is that talking about it at all makes it even more front and center to the American woman that has by and large become more pro-choice over time. Let's not forget that the vast majority of American millennial women, like me, born after 1981, have attended liberal arts colleges, know somebody that's had to experience an unintended pregnancy and had to make the tough choice of termination. So I believe no matter where Republicans start talking about where they believe a ban is right, the fact that the Supreme Court's overturn of Roe versus Wade kicked things back to Republican legislatures that are now acting more extreme than could have ever been thought conscionable. That is the biggest problem for the party moving forward, and it will be the death knell of the Republican Party in seeking the White House for 2024.
Joseph Williams, if we look at this, I mean, it seems to cut across so many conventional beliefs, doesn't it? I mean, I was talking about the case in Kansas, which is a conservative Republican state, where people say, look, they are opposed to overturning this legislation. There is, of course, also a very big block of evangelical voters in the Republican Party as well. I mean, I mentioned that one poll, that PBS NPR poll. There are others. There was a Gallup poll which showed that 52% of Americans identify as pro-choice, and 69% want abortions to be legal in the first trimester. What has changed so much?
Redistricting and the political right has changed so much. I mean, one of the things that we need to keep in mind here is that a lot of the states that have made abortion illegal not too long ago were states that at least Democrats had a shot at winning, but redistricting, the 2010 census, and states being able to gerrymander districts to lock in power, looking at you, Wisconsin, so they can basically bulldoze their way through legislation that makes things illegal, things that they don't like, and really brings the culture wars front and center. You also need to look at the engineered majority in the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, not too long ago, the court was 5-6. I mean, we could imagine that abortion rights might have been upheld if we still had the same Constitution. But you look at Trump taking office, Anthony Kennedy stepping down unexpectedly, or depending on how you look at it, cutting a deal with Trump, and the engineering of a majority by Mitch McConnell refusing to seat an Obama Supreme Court nominee. So not all of this is organic. I think a lot of this is kind of manufactured. The American people certainly aren't where the legislative body are on the right, and it shows in all this polling.
Jadan, Horyn, the Democratic Party Senator Patty Murray, she addressed the abortion issue, and she said this, and I'm quoting her, she said, every place where abortion rights were on the ballot last November, every single place, abortion rights won. Republicans are ignoring their constituents and doubling down on their extreme anti-abortion politics. What do you make of that? I mean, are Republican representatives misreading the mood of their supporters, of their constituents? Are they ignoring voters?
I mean, I think Patty Murray ignores her voters in eastern Washington. So, I mean, I think all legislators ignore their voters to some extent. But that's really immaterial here. I think Republicans should absolutely seize on the abortion issue. With a large part of their base, it is a winning message. But I think more importantly, what this reveals is that the Republican Party was never truly prepared for this victory. They did not understand that they would need to come to what we call an accommodation, which is an understanding that there is not a majority in this country that supports a blanket abortion ban, and there is not a majority that supports abortion at any level, period. There simply is not. No matter what way you look at those polls, people support restrictions at some point. It is finding that accommodation, which means they need to find legislative solutions that include viewpoints of constituents that they may not necessarily agree with. If it's 15 weeks, if it's 25 weeks, if it's 6 weeks. But unless we have these conversations, unless Republicans actually go out there and they speak on this, then they will not be able to find that solution. Running from the abortion issue will not make it go away. So I do agree with Democrats in that sense, and I do agree with the other panelists. It is absolutely incumbent upon Republicans to tackle this issue and to talk about it. Because at the end of the day, the only way that this issue is resolved for the American people is through the legislative process in each individual state per federalism.
Right, and when you say talk about it in what way?
Well, they really need to hear from their constituents on what level of restriction they would be comfortable with. We certainly know that even in states like New York that have almost no restrictions, that the voters do not overwhelmingly approve that. There is pushback, even from those that are not necessarily anti-abortion, if you want to use that term. Many Democrats are uncomfortable with abortion without restrictions. Many Democrats look to the European model, which generally takes 15 weeks. Or does not allow final trimester or third trimester abortions as a model. And Republicans should look and have those conversations and say, at what point can we accommodate? Because there will never be the ability to win a full blanket ban. And that's simply because the status quo has been so upended, right? The change was so sudden that voters in general, American voters are very pragmatic. So when the Supreme Court did that, and Republicans acted, and many states had those laws in place that suddenly banned it or were about to be put in place. They rescinded those because they said, "Wait, hold on, we do not want to. We do not want these blanket bans."
All right, Eleanor, great to see you. Eleanor, President Biden has made reproductive rights a centerpiece of his re-election campaign. In fact, he signed an executive order protecting access to contraception. And we know that there are a number of organizations, major organizations in the United States, including Planned Parenthood, which have endorsed the president's re-election campaign. How big an election issue is this going to be?
Oh, it's huge. And American people, you can't take away a right that's been in place for 50 years and expect everybody to say, fine, no problem. It has upended the healthcare market for women. When I say market, I'm not really talking only about abortion care. I'm talking about general care, with clinics that provided abortion but did lots of other health care having to close their doors in the face of these draconian laws. And you have President Biden taking what action he can with an executive order. You also have the governor of Arizona signed an executive order on the one-year anniversary of the overturning of Roe, where she is effectively banning local attorney generals in the state of Arizona from prosecuting some of the more extreme restrictions. And I think you're going to see, more of this with local officials in red states standing up for what you might want to call blue rights. And the division is extreme between red states and blue states, but red states also want basic abortion care. And it's not true that New York and other states have no restrictions in place. Roe had a 3-trimester definition, if you will. The first 3 months, fine. The second 3 months, restrictions were put in place in the various states. And the third trimester, when the health of the mother or there are gross fetal abnormalities, yes, occasionally there have to be abortion procedures performed, not because somebody couldn't fit into their prom dress. I mean, it really has been a belittling of women and what a serious issue this is. So Republicans are struggling to find something that will accommodate their ideology, and their supporters that are on the far right of this extreme measures against abortion and what the American people expect and want and demand. And it's very difficult to get a federal ban because you can't get a consensus in Washington. So they're going to be squirming all the way to the presidential nomination. And I think it's a losing issue for them, which they brought on by themselves with their extreme measures and basically with a stolen supermajority in the Supreme Court. And the fact that the Supreme Court's credibility for actually ethical violations is being called into question also happens at the same time that this ruling is questioned. So it's the trust in government and the effort on the part of activists on both sides to right the ship, will continue. And I think it's a powerful issue that the Republicans have handed the Democrats, but it's a powerful issue that hurts women and hurts women in their lives. So I'm not celebrating politically.
Rina, Shah, of course, many of the Republican candidates were at the Faith and Freedom Coalition annual conference that took place in Washington over the weekend. The issue of abortion rights came up. What did you hear? I mean, what was the mood there? And did you sense that candidates are beginning to become aware that they're not in step with the people who vote for them?
Well, this is a coalition is very important to any Republican candidate that's seeking the Republican nomination for president for many years. And I remember attending with two former members of the U.S. House of Representatives when I was a senior staffer on Capitol Hill. This is a place where you don't just define yourself. You find your community. You find the people that are going to back exactly what you have in mind. And so for the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, it was a very dark speech he gave, I thought, despite having done what he wanted. Florida is now a place where I don't think many younger women, particularly of reproductive age, feel that their rights are in line with this governor. And now he is a contender for the nomination for 2024. So you would think that the mood would have been very gleeful. Instead, it would continue to be very dark. And there was just so much talk of the left and how the left wants to do this to us and that to us. You almost forgot that they had a victory at the Supreme Court. So again, I think what I really see here is sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth for Republicans that understand that their stances right now, the way they talk about abortion right now and the lead up to the GOP primaries, is going to be not really in line with how they would talk about it if they were to be the person going up against Joe Biden in the general. I mean, the Kaiser Family Foundation just had a recent survey out this past month talking about how abortion remains a very key issue for voters, with Democrats holding a sizable lead over Republicans. I mean, this is not even a question anymore of how do Republicans message better on it. When you have a third of women say they'll only vote for someone who shares their views, you understand that there's something really wrong here, and it's not in favor of Republicans. So I think we'll continue to see this pandering to a very small segment of Americans.
Okay.
Anti-abortion, and it's not the right play for Republican candidates in 2024.
Right, Joseph Williams, I'm going to move on. As I said at the beginning of the show, it's been a busy week for the United States Supreme Court, something like 10 decisions expected this week. One of those decisions is to allow the congressional map to be redrawn. One of the decisions we heard about was to be redrawn in Louisiana and Alabama earlier this month. There was also the court decision which ruled in Biden's favor in an immigration case. That was a win for Democrats. What are your thoughts on the decision so far?
So far, it kind of looks like a couple of makeup calls. I mean, initially, the Alabama case, people expected it to go the other direction, mainly because Chief Justice John Roberts has been one of the most aggressive hawks on voting rights on the court, and it's been his core issue for such a long time that people didn't expect him to side with the liberals and hand a win to the Democrats that could possibly shift the balance of power in the Congress next year. So that kind of looked like a makeup call to me, and you couldn't decide that case in favor of the petitioners and not decide the Louisiana case the same way. A lot of people are saying it's just basic math, where you have 7 congressional districts in Alabama, 6 congressional districts in Louisiana. Each state has about a third or so percentage of African Americans, but only one representative in Congress. I mean, just the math alone doesn't add up. So that looked like a couple of very favorable decisions on the heels of some really bad press about ethics and about the justices, particularly Clarence Thomas and Justice Samuel Alito, cozying up to a lot of wealthy Republican donors, and the Federal Society kind of playing matchmaker there and getting them all together to these luxury vacations that just really is an awful look for the court. So those two are very much to what I consider make-up calls. The third decision about immigration in allowing Joe Biden to set rules for immigration laws at the border, that's kind of less of a clear-cut decision. It's more like keeping stasis and allowing him to do what he's been doing already. So it's less of a determinative decision and more of a placeholder decision. And it's probably going to come back around in a year or two, maybe once the elections happen. But overall, I think the Supreme Court very much has not necessarily changed direction, but offered a couple of crumbs to keep people from being too upset at them.
Jadan, Horyn, another major case concerns student debt relief. One representative of the Debt Collective, that's an organization that represents people who owe money, his name is Braxton Brewington, and he said this to Business Insider. He said, if the Supreme Court strikes down student debt relief, it will be a stark deviation from their rulings so far and further expose the political corruption within this court. Strong words there, Jadan, but what is the situation now? I mean, the Republicans recently stripped out the legislation on student debt relief, which was in that debt ceiling bill.
So first of all, whether someone has student debt or not doesn't mean that the president has the constitutional authority to override what is expressly the intent of Congress. Democrats controlled Congress for 2 years under Joe Biden. They had unified control. If they really wanted to give the legislative permission to allow this to occur, they should have. And they didn't. So the failure of Democrats is not the fault of Republicans. And so ultimately, what the Supreme Court will likely rule it's unconstitutional. They ought to rule it's unconstitutional. Congress needs to do its job, and Democrats need to run on it. And they have a lot of explaining they have to do to their own young voters about why, when they had control, they didn't do what they said they would do. So, you know, they can talk all about reproductive justice and everything else, and that's great. But how can women voters trust them to do what they say they're going to do when young people trusted Democrats to do what they said they were going to do, and they didn't do it?
Okay, Eleanor, I want to ask you about some changes to federal election rules. But first, a brief response to what Jadan said about student debt relief, the fact that the Democrats had both houses and didn't do anything.
However the decision comes out, I don't believe that the political backlash will be against Joe Biden for being unable to get a majority in a Congress as closely divided as it has been. I think the objection will more likely be aimed at Republicans who seem to think that federal relief is good for just about everybody else in society, but not for students who are trying to get ahead. So, and I don't know how this is going to come out. The White House says they're on strong legal ground, and I think if it doesn't go their way, I think the person you quoted is correct. It's going to be seen as a political decision.
Yeah, Eleanor. So I want to talk about these changes, proposed changes to federal election rules. There is a case in the Supreme Court right now. It's called the independent state legislature theory. Sounds very lofty, but it says basically that state legislatures have the exclusive authority to set federal election rules under the Constitution. What is the impact of this going to be if we look at, let's say, what happened in the last election?
Right. The impact of that would be to make legal what Trump and his allies tried to do in turning over the 2020 election by giving state legislative bodies the power to overturn the duly elected electors. I would be shocked if the Supreme Court went along with that. I mean, despite the Republican supermajority, they basically rejected every one of the Trump legal challenges to the 2020 election. And to turn over that kind of power to legislative, to supermajorities in red states would be basically endorsing Donald Trump's coup attempt in 2020. I don't think this court is capable of that, despite all of the ethical questions about them and despite the Republican influence. That for people who call themselves originalists, it's a bridge way too far. So that's where I stand on this issue.
Rina, Shah, one other case before the Supreme Court is affirmative action. It's been 20 years since the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the measure in college admissions. Why is it back in the court right now?
You know, what I find it to be is, this case about affirmative action is so almost lost, I would say, on the American electorate right now. I mean, there are so many people I've talked to about it. Do you know that it's back? Why is it back? And people can't seem to understand why. We're talking about admissions, and we're talking about how, students are seen in the face of what should be blind committees, right? And particularly Asian American students. The model minority myth is there. But then you've also got this new era where kids and look, this is not India where there's a caste system where somebody's determined about their stature in society or their socioeconomic status based on their last name. Yeah. You're finding people with certain names but really well-rounded resumes, academically very strong, having done certain things, are not being admitted into certain schools because of these quotas. And the affirmative action talk these days, I feel, is so greatly limited. It's just so kind of in a moment where unless it's happening to you, you don't really know what's going on. So I'll be really curious to see where the court comes down here.
All right, Joseph Williams, we are rapidly running out of time. I've got just over a minute for this, but it's one issue that we have not talked about, but it certainly is a major talking point among Republicans, and that is this investigation that's going on into the president's links to his son's business. Of course, we had that case that was resolved last week, the plea deal with his son, Hunter Biden. Is this going to get any election traction? Is it going to be a problem for the president?
It's already been a problem for the president. I don't think it's going to be a problem for most voters. They've either decided their minds up one way or the other. Hunter Biden's kind of a non-factor. Many presidential siblings and children have been problematic. This is just another one. I think Hunter Biden's case is probably going to submerge below the radar. And I think the only way it's going to be an issue is if Republicans continue to bring it up. Otherwise, it kind of looks like a non-starter to me. Okay, Jadan, I've only got 20 seconds. What's your answer to that?
Well, I think it's something that Republicans should bring up. I think it's, the whole issue that we have here is that, once again, I think the president needs to address these things. Right. And at the end of the day, the American people need to hear an answer. Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.